Greetings, everyone. My name is Adil Najam. I am the Dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies here at Boston University. Welcome, and I'm wonderful to have people with us to join us for our second installment for our Alumni Weekend Special, The World in Flux. Yesterday, we had a panel of my colleagues from the Pardee School who were talking and looking at the future of global politics. Today, we continue that conversation with a set of colleagues, this time on the future of the global economy. With me today are our three wonderful colleagues. We have Professor Vivien Schmidt, Professor Perry Mehrling, and Professor Kevin Gallagher, who will be joining us in this discussion on where the world economy is going, where development is going, what do we expect from Corona, but also from other aspects that were already going on for all of these processes to go into the near and longer term future. Before we start a conversation with them, as we did yesterday, I wanted to introduce and start the conversation with one of the projects that one of our centers here at the Pardee School has been doing. The Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future has spent this time since March talking to a lot of experts around the world on the question of what to expect from the world after coronavirus. And we've put together a slightly more than 2-minute clip for you of what we heard those experts saying about the economy. So let us hear that, and then we will come to our panel to discuss where things may go next.
Society will be transformed, I think, permanently. And this notion of returning to status quo ante is, I think, not possible.
I think that the level of shakeup in our global economy is going to be the most serious challenge civilization has faced in 300 or 400 years.
If you look at the responses to this crisis, it is often going to lead to an incredible increase in the levels of debt that households, governments, and corporations are going to have.
When you're hit with something like Corona, which is simultaneously a demand and supply shock, and it continues in waves, this type of growth model that's based on consumption, it's a disaster.
How does the EU solve the problem of the pandemic economic crisis and also pull itself out of the Eurozone crisis?
The big question that I wish we had an answer for, and so far I don't think we have an answer for, is where will the good jobs come from?
Developing countries need to find as much fiscal space as they can possible. They are fighting the virus. Their debt is ballooning. They're also losing remittances, which many countries rely on.
I would not expect many developing countries to get to 2019 levels of income by 2025.
One positive thing that has come out of this crisis might be to make developing countries more self-confident and make them seek their own ways.
If you said 40 years ago that inequality would have gotten a lot worse, people would have said, well, there'll be a revolution. Maybe it'll get worse still and there won't be a revolution. Maybe this time will be too much.
A society that wants to deal with inequality, poverty, and injustice can, but it does mean you have to reduce the extreme, obscene levels of wealth in comparison to the extreme levels of poverty.
We need to develop an economic system, an international economic order, and a regulation of globalization that brings us to a more equitable and also sustainable development model for the future.
Since the first voice you heard on that video was of my colleague Perry Mehrling, maybe we will start from there and extend this conversation. That was a wide range of issues. A lot of people saying things may not be very good. Things are certainly not going to remain the way they were. And these were done across since March, between March and September. So Perry, maybe I will ask you to set us off on this conversation. Sitting now as we do in October in a crisis, in a pandemic that continues, what do you see when you see the future of the global economy?
Well, it is in fact about 6 months since those words when I said, I don't think we're going to return to status quo ante. And I guess I would say that again, some of the outlines of where we're going are beginning to emerge. Somewhat, maybe surprisingly, some of the stresses of status quo ante have been accelerated by this crisis. So the global imbalances, inequality, these things have actually gotten worse, okay, because of, and I think maybe that's even a bit of a surprise, but they have been made worse by the pandemic. But those are familiar things. There are some new things that are beginning to emerge. Sometimes people call the K-shaped recovery, meaning that the rich are doing better and the poor are doing worse, but also some industries are doing extremely well. Zoom, for example, and some industries are doing very poorly, restaurants, for example. And so there's a bifurcation in this recovery. There are also some new kind of ventures. We're experimenting, work from home, learn from anywhere. These have been invented in the last 6 months, okay, and have been refined, and they may change some things permanently, as we'll see. At the moment, I feel two more points to make. We're kind of in a Wile E. Coyote moment a little bit, where because a lot of debt forbearance, rent moratoriums, which are going to come due, okay? And so we're going to have state and municipal fiscal crises. We're going to have eviction crises. There's going to be, that shoe has not dropped. We've just been holding off for a while. And so there will be additional short-run pain. But I want to even look through that and put on the table the even deeper trends that we might want to talk about, which is this the end of globalization? Are we entering a period of deglobalization? And in fact, very specifically of onshoring of some industries that are considered to be too vitally national interest. We haven't seen much of that yet, okay, because that requires changing supply lines and things that takes time. But there's certainly a lot of talk about this, and there's some resistance in the business world, and so some of this is being pushed by politics. But if it's the end of globalization, we're moving the opposite direction, there are lots of changes that will be and not necessarily for the good. And this would be very different for the center and the periphery. But so I do think I would hold to what I said 6 months ago, that we're not returning to status quo ante. Oddly, some trends have accelerated. This sometimes happens in wartime, that history speeds up. But we also do have some new straws in the wind.
In fact, I would venture that in a way, status quo ante, whatever that was, is no longer there. That the change is not something we are waiting for, but we are now already maybe in a world that COVID is creating, a dynamic changing world where we'll see a whole bunch of things. But we'll come back to that. Maybe Vivien, if I can move with you, and if you could also unmute yourself. But Perry already brought these questions of the political economy into the mix, and you have a new book that on Europe's crisis of legitimacy, and you were talking already in that clip about the Eurozone crisis, and in some ways, that's an incubator of what we might see elsewhere. What do you see when you look at the future of the global economy in terms of the world?
So I think Perry's absolutely right on the general trends. So if we look more specifically at Europe and ask what has it done, and is this somehow a blueprint for the future, what I can say is that it has completely reversed itself compared to what it did. If we think about the Eurozone crisis in 2010, it doubled down on the rules, austerity, structural reform, and particularly harsh in countries like Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, but also Spain and Italy had to cut, had to crush unions, all of that. We've seen a complete reversal what had been seen as an asymmetric shock, where Northern Europeans said, oh, it's those Southern Europeans or Ireland, they spent way above their means. They need to be punished. It's all about debt. They need to pay it back, said the Northern European creditors. Now everything has changed. This is a symmetric crisis in the sense that the pandemic hit everyone, although again, more in Southern Europe. But instead of saying, okay, it's your fault, they said, no, we all need to come together and deal with this. So just as in the United States, but much harder for Europe, but it did it. It had expansive programs in terms of unemployment at the European Union level. The member states, all the various countries of Europe, immediately broke the deficit and debt rules, invested massive amount of money to bolster their economies, to deal with issues of unemployment, et cetera, very generous. And most importantly, they broke with the past in terms of saying, okay, Europe is going to have what other nation states have, which is a European central bank and European debt, European central bank that will actually do even more than it did before in terms of quantitative easing, but a European recovery fund that would actually provide investment in terms of not just loans, but grants to all of the countries in need, in particular in the South. And for the first time, European Union level debt, bonds, issued by the European level, which had been taboo before, and including a third of these in terms of green bonds. So very, very significant for Europe. And if this could be a blueprint for the world, it would mean that other countries too, that nation states, but regions would actually try to find ways to attack uneven development, inequalities, not simply within countries, but between them.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring this to Kevin, and as we open up, and again, you can all unmute if you want on this. But just like Perry and Vivien have been extremely engaged in the debates that we've been having, or the discussion we've been having about both what is happening and what should happen. Kevin, you and the center that you lead, the Global Development Policy Center, the GDP Center, has not just been engaged, but sort of really leading the charge in helping the world think about what does this mean for the world as a whole, particularly developing countries in terms of their economies, of debt, what international institutions should do. So on any of those, as you hear Perry and Vivien talking about this, where do you see sort of the big important change coming from? And before you go, I should add to those of our friends watching online live, please add your questions now. Don't wait for later. My colleagues and I can see the questions and we'll try to bring them into the conversation. But Kevin, what do you see?
Well, first, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our alumni. It's great to have this conversation with you, and I hope next year we're all doing this in person. As I look at the video for me 6 months ago, unfortunately, the only thing that's changed is the size of my beard, which it's just too difficult to teach for 3 hours here at BU in Kenmore Square with a beard that long. But I do see the world the same way that I did 6 months ago. But like Professor Mehrling and Professor Schmidt both said, it's actually even a little bit worse than I thought. The biggest challenge facing the global economy, the full global economy, all 200 plus countries, is the need to build back a better multilateral international economic set of institutions that can anticipate crises like these, that can try to prevent crises like these, and then can pull together the necessary resources and global cooperation to mitigate crises like these. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis has laid bare how dysfunctional the system has become. The International Monetary Fund, which is the largest multilateral institution in charge of trying to maintain some of this kind of financial stability and global prosperity, estimates that the world economy will contract more than it ever has since the Great Depression in 2020, much more than 2008. For Latin America, they see almost a 10% contraction in economic growth in 2020. To put that into context, that would put them back to about where their GDP per capita, the level of income, was in 2010. So it's an erased decade of progress for a whole region. Now, where the advanced economies have been able to have aggressive monetary policy and put together over $12 trillion worth of fiscal policy to try to buoy their economies and attack the virus, developing countries, about 150, 175 countries around the world have not had that opportunity to be able to take that kind of aggressive action. In fact, because the advanced economies took that kind of aggressive action, investors pulled all of their money outside of developing countries and put them back into the safety of those countries that were taking the aggressive action. That depreciated the currencies of most developing countries, which were already experiencing a massive debt crisis or debt distress before up until 2019. And now, as yesterday, the International Monetary Fund outlined, the shoe has already dropped for the majority of the world. Professor Mehrling says we're going to see it in municipalities across the United States, probably later in 2021, 2022. But the emerging market and developing countries are already starting to experience a massive debt crisis. And what makes it so grave right now is that they are experiencing debt distress exactly when they need to be mobilizing as much financing as possible to attack the virus, protect the vulnerable, and mount a green and inclusive recovery. Most developing countries are spending in between 30 and 70% of all government revenue just to pay back international bondholders right now. The country of Nigeria is spending 72% of every tax dollar that comes in has to go out the door to pay bondholders and to pay international creditors around the world. The system, the International Monetary Fund and other international institutions in and around the G20 is supposed to be able to try to combat that. In 2008, they did a pretty good job. They mobilized a lot of new financing and signaled to countries that they should be able to try to use fiscal policy and so forth to attack that. The problem is all these institutions are built around US power and US veto power, and the United States abandoned these institutions in the middle of this crisis back in March and April. China and the European Union really stepped up and encouraged that, just like we were doing in the advanced economies, that the International Monetary Fund should increase its resources and make them available, help countries forgive debt, at least in the short term. But unfortunately, because the US has veto power, they blocked all that. This is analogous to what the MIT economic historian Charles Kindleberger refers to as a Kindleberger trap. This happened in 1933 when the world came together for a London Economic Conference to try to stem the globalization of the Great Depression. But Great Britain didn't have the power. It was a declining power and didn't step up to do that. The United States wasn't quite ready to do that either. That's basically what happened in April and March and April here, where the United States declined to step up for the rest of the world. And even though China and Europe had a better vision, the institutions, the IMF and largely the G20, are built around the US veto power, and the US vetoed it. This is a huge problem. If we don't take action to expand resources for the poor, to provide real and meaningful debt relief, not just through official creditors, but through the private sector, we're going to see more death, more contraction, more populism, as Professor Schmidt talks about all the time. That's going to put a drag on the world economy. And if history's anything, all that just leads to conflict. And so we've got a choice. I think there's going to be two possibilities here, or three. One is, if the United States makes a change and there's a new president, can the United States go back to these institutions and be re-enlightened leaders and have an enlightened set of hegemony in these institutions? Or is it too late for that? Do we need to build back a better set of international institutions that are truly multilateral and don't allow one country to be able to call all of the shots? Unlike my colleagues, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the status quo right now, because the status quo has so many vested interests in it, in the way that the world worked up into 2019. And those folks those are among the world in the K-shaped recovery that are doing really well. And so I think we're going to see more inequality, more populism, and more conflict in the short term. And I'm scared to see what it might turn out to in the long term, unless we really solve some collective action problems and have some global leadership and some global cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're going to come back to this question of sort of the political impact, if you will, especially of how it may be a common pandemic, but it doesn't really impact everyone the same, given our ability to do something about it, like disasters. It has inequities built into how people can respond. But maybe one more set of questions. Anyone can go, and maybe we'll start with Perry. But all of you have highlighted the importance of institutions, and one of my learning has been the importance of debt, which I really think, as a layperson, I wasn't fully understanding until everyone started saying, debt is going to be a really big thing. And for example, in that video, we have sort of Atif Mia saying that the way we usually deal with it globally and the institutions, we may not be able to because it's everywhere, and so on and so forth. But the question I would like to throw for anyone, maybe starting with you, Perry, is how do you see institutions of our economic institutions having performed, or what do you see the challenges for them in the future?
In that video that you took 6 months ago, I distinguished 3 stages of this: stop the bleeding, win the war, win the peace. And I want to emphasize that we have stopped the bleeding, okay? That we're on to stage 2, okay, at this moment. And then, in a paradoxical sort of response, maybe to Kevin, it's very important to appreciate that the Federal Reserve of the United States acted as the global lender of last resort. It really did, okay, back in March, and prevented basically a meltdown of the global financial system. So this is a little paradoxical that the Fed is operating as a central bank of the world, sort of unilaterally. Okay, it's true that it's not multilateral and that it's therefore unequal. We're helping swap lines with our friends in Europe and Japan, but not the global South, which is trickling down or not. And I very much appreciate the quite different experience that's happening in the global South. So, but winning the war against coronavirus is not going that well. And winning the peace, which is thinking about what is the industrial structure, what is the global system going to look like when we going through beyond coronavirus, this seems not to be going well at all. And we're not thinking about it. Now, you mentioned debt. Debt can be a great burden in preventing us from moving forward. We need to remember, Kevin was mentioning about 1933, the failure to resolve the inter-allied debts after World War I, okay, was really prevented the world from getting on with things. And we had to have a depression in World War II before we could deal with that. And we did not deal with the post-war debts in the same way after World War II as we did after World War I. We learned our lesson, okay? Today, a lot of this debt is private debt, and it's not intergovernmental debt, and this is much more difficult to deal with, and it's not just international. This is, again, I would say, within the core, the fact that commercial real estate is in a center city, like here I am in New York City. No one's in their offices at all. What's the future of the multi-story office building? We're not sure. We're not sure. People are leaving their apartments and moving to upstate New York because they can work from home. So it is inevitable in this period, I think, that there's an inward turning inside the United States we have to solve our own problems. This is what happened in 1933 with Roosevelt, saying we cannot pick up the baton of world leadership because we have internal problems. I think we are in a period like that, I'm afraid to say. And things are going to get worse before they get better. But we can prepare and we can begin thinking about possible futures.
I'm going to pick up on what you said. Things are going to get worse before they get better. We have a very good set of questions already coming in. We had on debt, Isaac talking about it. But one of those questions from Julia Clark, who's an alum as well as a member of our Dean's Advisory Board, is asking, where will the recovery come from? So after they are worse, where will they start getting better? Or where should we be pushing them to start getting better? Her question is more about emerging debt markets, but in general also. Vivien?
Yeah, I was thinking, listening to Perry and also Kevin, my God, this is depressing. So I'm going to use Europe as a positive case, but I think we see it elsewhere as well. But I think Kevin is right that there's a serious problem for developing countries that don't have the money. But debt is a problem only if it's not used productively. And productive debt, in other words, investment, is really what's necessary. So the positive spin on this, as in Europe, but we can see it also, hopefully, we can always hope for the future in the US, that we get major investment. And what the EU Recovery Fund is doing is saying we need to invest in a whole range of areas. In infrastructure, not just roads, but digital infrastructure. And there again, you see major inequalities, not simply between countries, Southern versus Northern Europe, but also within countries, rural areas. Well, you see this in the US as well. Rural areas that simply don't have appropriate access to the internet and to digital platforms of various kinds. All of that needs massive investment. Beyond that, climate change, renewable energy. There's a whole way in which one can muster debt, not simply to spend it on consumption, which obviously there's some need for that to restart economies, but even more, we need to be much more productive with it and to use it to, for electric cars, for energy stations, for housing, sort of all sorts of ways in which one can invest in infrastructure. But beyond that, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of climate change, as I mentioned earlier, green bonds are a very important part of these new European level bonds that are going to come out. And so basically for Europe, but for elsewhere, it means not only encouraging EU level spending, but also at the national level in Europe to think about, essentially, rather than in the past, when it was all about fiscal hawkishness, make sure you don't spend too much, it's all about deficits and debt. Now what you need to have are kind of industrial policy councils that say, here's how we need to invest. Here's where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. And also, here's how we can bring people together to move forward in a whole range of productive ways. I mean, we are at the cusp. We're in a very dangerous moment, not simply in terms of rise of poverty and inequality, but also climate change and the destruction that we've seen everywhere, in particular in the West and the US in terms of fires, but flooding in the Midwest, floods in all over Europe as well, and fires. All of that is about climate change. So one needs to, at the same time, take debt, invest it in a way to also then boost economies, move them in a different direction, in a more positive direction to fight all of the problems at the same time. And obviously, and this is the case for Europe, but elsewhere we hope as well, also help developing countries. We're an interdependent world.
In that, and I think Julia's question, Vivien's response has brought us right to this recovery question, which I want to spend a lot of time with all of you on. What does that look like and how do you go about it? But I don't want to leave this round, Kevin, before coming to you on institutions. Right. So Perry seems to be saying, I hope I get this right, that the Fed, difficult word, but has tried valiantly. Vivien earlier was saying, slow start, but the European Bank tries hard. How do you grade international economic institutions in what they have done or are planning to do?
Well, in terms of, I like Professor Mehrling's three stages. So in terms of the first stage, unfortunately, the International Monetary Fund is the only place that's there for the whole world, and they failed in the ways that I've talked about. I would definitely agree with Professor Mehrling that the Federal Reserve shored up the the advanced economies, financial systems, and the global dollar system. But as I said, in so doing, that actually made the rest of the world worse off because investors pulled their money out of the South to be part of this big party of new money and security in the North. And so it had adverse impacts in increasing all of this debt and making the shoe drop now in the South relative to in the North. And the International Monetary Fund came out of all of these meetings after recognizing the failure of 1933. It was founded in 1944, and it was supposed to really be there to plug those holes for those countries that aren't part of that core that Professor Mehrling's talking about. The Federal Reserve only extended swap lines to Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, a very small handful of countries that are outside of the sort of big industrial complex. And so we need resilient multilateral institutions. And there was a prevailing idea that they needed to, the United States was the leader of the alliance of winning World War II, and the institution, basically the whole voting structure is built around the United States getting to either be the leader in terms of enlightenment and setting policy, and it's set up in terms of its voting structure that the United States can veto any major proposal. And there's been a retreat away from multilateralism under the Trump administration, and they did not want to extend the kinds of frameworks that the Federal Reserve did for the dollar system for the global financial system and the economies of the poor, which is why they're in such crisis right now. I don't want to be pessimistic in both of my interventions. I want to follow on Vivien's lead. I think one positive development before up until 2019 was a recognition by financial actors and some multilateral actors that we need to really fix the financial system. The financial system, unfortunately, has become it's always been inherently unstable. We saw that in 2008, but it doesn't serve productive investments the way Vivien was talking about. It's been the job of public banks like the World Bank or the KfW in Germany or the Brazilian National Development Bank. They're the ones who have been trying to finance renewable energy transitions, climate resilience, so forth, because the regular financial system could make more, could do better if it just created new debt instruments and new derivatives that could be traded and so forth. That's where the action is in the financial system, and it's starved in these kind of productive investments. There was a lot of movement in central banks in Europe and in China to create these green bond instruments, but more importantly, to create new regulations for what you can float bonds for in an attempt to try to steer the financial system towards productive investments, towards the transition that we need to a more resilient and zero carbon economy by 2050. And that could be derailed with the debt crisis and the turn of austerity. So we really have to be concerned in the G20, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese really have to step up and play a leadership role to send the right signals that we don't move into a period of austerity, so that we can continue to push towards major commitments that we made in 2015 to achieve a number of sustainable development goals and to achieve the Paris climate commitments, and make the financial system and the world economy be socially inclusive and low carbon.
Thank you for that. And you've set us up for our next set of questions very, very well. But also more importantly, I'm glad you brought in the hope and where hope might come from. It also responds to the question we had from Rebecca Dunn, who's both an alumni and a former colleague who was looking for hope. But more directly, Pamela has a question also from yesterday, Pamela Scott Harahan, about where is Mother Nature in all of this? And in some of ways, how do we bring Mother Nature into the recovery? So to respond to that, let me cue up another short 2-minute clip on what global experts are saying about that in terms of how we go to the next move. And then we'll come back to our panel to talk more about the recovery question.
I don't think one can even mention sustainability unless you recognize that ecosystem health equals human health.
Humanity is placing too many pressures on the natural world with damaging consequences.
What happens in the long term to biodiversity is going to depend on the course of our collapse.
We also need to make sure we prioritize a food future that coexists in harmony with nature.
The big problem, of course, is that problems of poverty and problems of inequality impinge on the question of food availability.
It's now the 21st century, and there are still 800 million people worldwide that don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water, and over 2 billion people worldwide that don't have access to adequate sanitation services. Even without a pandemic, even without a public health crisis, that is a public health crisis.
75 years from now, we're going to run the world on sun and wind because it's cheap and clean. But if it takes 75 years to get there, the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world.
We have many opportunities to really transform our economy as we come out of COVID.
We need to come back with a cleaner economy. We should be able to make our societies more resilient, grow the number of jobs, and actually grow the security of our energy system.
Do we prop up the fossil fuel industry, or do we, as we did during the recession, choose to make an investment in green technologies?
You now have these extraordinary sums of money being mobilized overnight. We could not find it in ourselves for the past 10 years to find a way to mobilize $100 billion in order to accelerate our collective capacity to move towards a low-carbon economy.
We have another global pandemic, global planetary emergency looming. And can we use this opportunity, can we learn from this to actually fix the way for the future?
The coronavirus pandemic, in my view, is a harbinger of a much, much bigger emergency to come. And everybody is now seeing that.
The bottom line is that our recovery from this pandemic must guide us to a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future.
I'll come back to this. Those are again powerful voices, and I'll say one thing that I, in doing that series, was surprised by was how many people, whether one asked the question or not, as they thought of the recovery, brought issues like climate change, both as the next possible crisis, but also as an opportunity. The fact that Jeff Sachs brings that up is not a surprise. But when Angus Deaton, you ask him what next, and he says climate change. And when you ask Piketty what next, and he says climate change, you start seeing, okay, there's a big sense here of both an opportunity, but also looming challenges. And I want to frame this within the idea of where do we go with the recovery, that being one part of it. Kevin, if I could start this round with you, any thoughts, any reactions, because you work on these issues of development, sustainable development, where does that fit into this question of recovery?
Yeah, well, you ask, where is Mother Nature in this? She's screaming at us. This is largely the pandemic itself is largely a function, or in part a function at least, of a lack of an attention to Mother Earth, the destruction of biodiversity, and the proliferation of the wildlife trade. Those animals and parts of the ecosystems in the world that do survive in a world of biodiversity have much more pathogens and are much more susceptible to the expansion of pandemics. So in many ways, the pandemic itself is in part a function of a lack of attention to biodiversity and ecosystem health around the world. And also, Mother Nature is speaking to us in the middle and making it very difficult for us to deal with the recovery. The Caribbean, over the past year, as this has happened, has been racked by climate-related hurricanes, and obviously California, who got a lot of points early on in the pandemic for jumping on it quickly, is now struggling to respond because of the climate-related forest fires that have or fires that have racked through it. And so I think it's our job in academia, and what we try to do at our center, the GDP Center at BU, is to bring together folks from the natural sciences, social sciences together, so we can start to make some of these connections earlier, before things like this happen. One of the great things about the pandemic, though, I mean, not that there's anything great about the pandemic, but one of the things that's changed with respect to Mother Nature is that it's completely part of the discourse now. And as Professor Schmidt, who really is an expert on sort of politics of discourse, every leader is saying the right thing. There is a universal global understanding that winning the peace, as Professor Mehrling calls it, really has to have sustainable development at its core. Whether it's in the United States, which we have a massive sustainable development problem, or in the Caribbean, it's going to be manifest in different ways in different parts of the world. But there's an understanding that we need to build back better, that we have to have new economies that run on new kinds of energy, that have new kinds of jobs, and that are organized in ways that take ecosystem services seriously, and that help us shift to a new structure of a world economy built on different kinds of energy, transportation, and so forth. The big challenge is, one, putting those words into action. It's first, the most important thing is to start talking about it. I think the world has now come to realize that, with a few exceptions. So one, putting the words to action, but two, we've got to figure out a way to do it without leaving anyone behind. A new economy means leaving an old economy behind. And as some of your speakers on these videos showed, there are lots of vested interest and lots of good people working in an economy that doesn't work in general, and really is exacerbating environmental crises in particular. And one of the things that folks who have worked so long on the environment haven't quite put together yet is how to make sure that this transition is a just one. And that is our project. That is our global project that is manifest differently in different countries around the world. But that is what winning the peace is. Winning the peace is building back a better global economy, a sum of national economies that makes a transition from a 20th century modern economy to a 21st century modern economy that is built on zero carbon, that is much more equal, and that has a financial system that fuels that rather than goes off into its own direction. And the discourse is there. You have the head of the International Monetary Fund. You have most heads of states in the G20 saying that this has to be done. What we need is a coordinated effort to do it. And that brings us back to the institutions. We need global institutions to be able to coordinate on that. And we have a crisis of multilateralism right now. Every country, to make multilateralism work, by definition, every country has to step up and play more of a leadership role and realize that this is a collective problem that needs a collective solution. And we're starting to wake up to that, where the discourse is there. Now we have to put words into action to win the peace.
Let me come to Vivien on this before I go to Perry. Sort of this notion of, it's not just about rebuilding, it's rebuilding back. It's not just building back, it's building back better. And for me, I think one of those aha moments was talking to Thomas Piketty, who kept talking about it as an opportunity and wanted to remind us that it isn't as if the world was a great place in terms of the economy back in January. And that if you have to rebuild back, why would you rebuild back to a place that we were already pointing problems with, but rebuild back to a better place? Is there a better place to build back to? You have talked about, not just green bonds, but orange bonds, and you've started us off on this conversation. What would rebuilding back to a better place entail?
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm going to have two things that we need to talk about. One is the kinds of policies, but also the politics. And I think we need to pay attention to the politics of political economy. So in terms of the policies, I think people basically know the things that need to be done. The green bonds mean investing in, as Kevin already said, investing in infrastructure, in renewable energy, in insulating houses, but we've known that for years, but also for people to transition. And people were left behind for a very long time. There needs to be education, training, so that people can actually transition from old jobs, old dirty jobs, to new green jobs, clean jobs. That's a massive effort because it means investing in education, in training, vocational and others, in addition to all of the infrastructure issues, digital infrastructure, but also for the US, transportation, trains that actually work and get places on time. Also, not only urban, but also in rural areas. And I already mentioned digital, but all of this requires the politics. Actually, having been accused of being an optimist before and Kevin the pessimist, now I see Kevin as the optimist, thinking that the rhetoric, that the discourse is already there. I mean, I've been looking at populist leaders and that discourse is not there, or if it's there, it's often not a discourse of interdependence. We have to all do it together. It's, basically, climate change we'll deal with in our own way, get back to nature, but not think about the so the cross-border issues. And I'm thinking about even amongst European countries. But you also have climate deniers there. And of course, we've also mentioned the US has been a real drag on international efforts. But the problem is also, even so, we've got populist leaders, some of whom do this just because they want to get to power. It's great, we'll oppose it. Others, climate skeptics. But there are others who basically say, look, we have many coal-powered plants. We're going to try to get as much money out of this as we can, or we're going to stop it. I'm thinking about Poland here and other Central European countries that have been resisting doing much about climate change. But then look at mainstream leaders who say, oh, well, this is going to be costly. It takes a great leap forward to think about how we get beyond this, what kinds of investments, productive investments we can do. What I see with COVID is that certainly in Europe, not so much in the US, or at least you see it on the Democrat side, but not on the Republican. It's sort of a recognition we need massive investment to do this, regardless of what the debt involves. That's really important, but we still have perhaps too much caution. And as Kevin said, it's got to be international. It can't just be national. Europe is going to fail anyway, even if it does meet its 2030 goals and its 2050 goals, which are more ambitious, I think, than anywhere else.
And this takes us to, again, one of the questions that's been asked by Xenia is about sort of, about global cooperation, where it will come from. And I, as you mentioned, optimism, pessimism, I also thought of our discussion yesterday with our colleagues on multilateralism, which has been one of those things missing in action. One of the surprises has been that in this most global of crises, the one thing that was clearly missing was international cooperation. It was more borders closing, more institutions backing up and everyone going their own way. But now I might be the pessimist, but I want to hear from Perry because he launched us on this ship. So Perry, winning the peace, what will it take?
So let me just underline a few things that we've heard. Okay, that there are these obstacles, political obstacles, stranded assets, Vivien was speaking of. And I was speaking about debt overhang, and those sorts of things. So the dead hand of the past is a problem, okay? And that dead hand of the past is a problem even more so because it's embedded in power structures of the present. Okay, so this is a problem. Okay, how do you get out of that? Okay, discourse is the start, but what we really need is concrete visions of a possible future. Okay, and a possible future to shift attention from the dead end of the past to a possible way that we could go. I think that imagining that we can only do this if we all do this together, I think that's probably true eventually. Okay, but if we wait to do it all together, I think it's not going to happen. You need to start. You need to start here. Maybe Europe is the place where it's starting. Okay, and this will be. I think that is sort of what Vivien is telling us, that Europe may be constructing something that could be an example. And then we say, well, why don't we do that? You know, what's so great about Europe? We could do that. You know, why not? You know, but at the moment, we do not have very much in the way of concrete examples of possible futures. It's talk, it's imagining things. But that is actually, you know, that's what finance does, is to capitalize dreams. Okay, which dreams are we going to capitalize? That's what's at stake in politics right now. Which dreams of the future are we going to capitalize and therefore make possible to build the first steps of it and of making those dreams a reality?
I love the which dreams idea. So I'm going to, as we come to the end of an hour, and it went so fast. But let me put it this way. I will read a question, not necessarily for you to answer, but I think it is something to think about before I come to my question. And this is again from Nikhil Kumar about how much of this is a problem about how we have conceptualized, intellectualized the problem of economics and the problems of development. But I'll leave that aside, not aside. I will link that to the question I want to ask. I give each of you one dream. If I can give each of you one wish, what would you wish for? What is it that something that can be done and by whom that will take us to winning the peace to a better place? Kevin, if you had one wish, what would you want to be done and by whom?
I don't want to, my first reaction is somewhat of a political one, but since I've only got a minute, I don't have time to edit myself. I personally think the one first baby step is a new president of the United States, and the United States to stand up again for multilateralism and to start to encourage a global conversation about true dreams. The great thing about what we're considering a dream here is actually there's a lot of thinking about what a 21st century economy looks like that is sustainable and inclusive. We know what it is. That's what that discourse is all about. We don't have a great way to get there because I would agree you need leadership and first movers. But at the end of the day, since these are global public good problems, you need a global way to get there. But I would agree that with Professor Mehrling that you need a couple countries to put a way forward. And unfortunately, the model of growth and development that started in Europe and moved to the United States, Japan, and now China, when the rest of the world looks at us, even though we complain about our situation, they'd rather have some of our situations than theirs. And so this old model is the model for the rest of the world. And so that leadership in part has to come from us. And sorry to be political, but I do think
that is good. And I would urge actually everyone watching as well as those who might watch later in recording, please actually do visit the website and explore it. Spend time at the website of our Global Development Policy Center that Kevin leads, because a lot of the thinking he's talking about, these new ideas, are really there, and that will be time well spent. But Vivien, coming to you, your wish. Kevin says leadership. Kevin says multilateralism. And Vivien Schmidt says what?
I say that my dreams have been fulfilled in terms of the EU. At least they're beginning to be fulfilled, that we've got the reversal of past policies. So let me tell you about my nightmare, which is also, of course, a dream. And the nightmare is that debt, this is how we started our conversation, that debt comes back in a big way, that neoliberalism is resilient again. I co-edited a book on that in 2013 on resilience of neoliberalism in Europe's political economy, and that seems gone. The danger is that it comes back, that debt becomes a massive focus. So now back to, away from the nightmare, back to the dream. My dream is that people recognize that only through productive investment can we move forward. And that requires not just money, but also leadership. And it also requires an end to populism. And I think we're beginning to see that the people are saying, expertise may be important, that populist leaders in particular are the ones that are getting infected by the coronavirus. This is a serious thing, and that we need to take all of these dangers seriously in terms of not just COVID, but climate change, and that we need to start working together rather than rather than polarizing everything, and recognizing that our countries need to cooperate, that the regional areas need to cooperate and collaborate, and that the international institutions need to create a space.
Sobering thoughts. Perry, you get the last word. Dreams, nightmares. What do you dream of? What do you want?
I've heard dreams and nightmares. When I said that we have to start somewhere, I guess I want to say, let's start here, here at the Pardee School, here in my classroom. One of the things that has been remarkable about the semester here, this Learn From Anywhere thing, where I have a student dialing in from China at 2 a.m., from South Korea at 2 a.m., and some from Boston who are still remote, and few in the classroom. And we have never had a more vigorous discussion. This class I've taught last year and the year before. The notion that these questions are what we need to be talking about, okay? What this generation here at Pardee School, okay, is preparing themselves to go out into the world and make these dreams a reality, okay? That's what we're doing here on the ground. So to me, I'm thinking about how I can contribute locally. I can't make the United States do anything, okay? But I can have an impact in the classroom, and I'm very glad to have that opportunity every day. And I hope that Pardee School will double and triple and quadruple and change the world.
Thank you for that wonderful way also to end. I also think I think if I don't know about dreams, but hope, I think it is on the young. And I sense the same. People are thinking about things in different, more active ways. I think the young generation has figured out this is for them to solve. This is the world they're going to get, but they can make it a better world. That would be the message I would take from all of you. Ain't easy, but is necessary. And that might be possible. So thank you, all of you. Thank you to all of the people who've joined us and enriched the discussion with wonderful questions, wonderful ideas. My gratitude to Professor Mehrling, my gratitude to Professor Schmidt, to Professor Gallagher for joining us today. Please join us again tomorrow, all of you. Tomorrow, same time, same place, we do the third part of what we are calling a crash course on the future of the world. And tomorrow in the third part, we will be talking about the future of global values. And we will be joined by Professor Rachel Brule, Professor Tim Longman, Professor Adela Pineda, and Professor Mike Waldemariam to talk about what does this mean at society level. And what does it mean in terms of what we've talked about, politics and economics, when we put it together at the individual and societal level. So I hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Be safe, be well, and keep making the world a better place.